Thanks for joining us today on SAI TV. My name is Fanuel, and I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Ranya Virk. She's a postdoc scholar at UCSF. In fact, you just started there, Ranya. So that's a fantastic journey, by the way. So she is a biomedical engineer by training, biophysicist, and with experience in developing computational models and integrating them with bioinformatics approaches and nanoimaging to study the structure and function of chromatin. Now, that was a lot, and we're not going to get into that today, okay? If you're interested in her work, you should Google her and look at what she is studying. What we are talking about today is a 2021 paper that she co-authored. The paper was titled "A Call to Diversify the Lingua Franca of Academic STEM Communities" in the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And a fun fact, it won second place in that policy position paper competition. Congrats, by the way, that was good.
Yeah.
Another fun fact, I met Ranya at a recent webinar, Making Science Accessible for All. This is a National Science Policy Network webinar. And so the world is really tiny. I'm so excited to have connected with you at that webinar and learned about this paper of yours. And I want to just tell everybody, just a quote from the paper that I found really fascinating and to ground us in our conversation today. And I quote this from the paper: "The current bias in STEM Academy favors English language research publications, creating a barrier between English-speaking and non-English speaking researchers that is detrimental to the continuity and evolution of STEM research." And it goes on, "In academia, other diversity and cultural issues have been intentionally addressed, but global linguistic diversity desperately needs to be modernized." And so I'm really excited to dig deeper into this paper, Ranya. Let me start. What inspired you to look at this question?
Sure. So I think that this call for the Journal of Science and Policy paper, we were trying to think of, like ways that were a little bit more out of the box that people normally intentionally think about diversity within the STEM Academy. And I know that recently there have been a lot of conversations, about race, about ethnicity, about gender. And we thought that, a language discussion was really lacking. And I think we were trying to think of what exemplifies STEM professionalism currently, and you were like, okay, a middle-aged white man, but also someone who speaks fluent English. And then we kind of dove deep into that. One of my co-authors brought up the fact that African American vernacular English is not considered something that's professional in STEM. So that kind of really spearheaded our initiative to dive deeper into the overall language issues that exist. And this is kind of issues that are experienced by many different groups of people, both within the United States who have come from different countries who don't natively speak English, but also scientists that live outside of the United States that are trying to perform research that is more undervalued and less cited in the English-speaking community.
Yeah, and I think let's get deeper into this, right? Because you cited some numbers in there, which I think people should know. So 97% of papers in Web of Science, Science Citation Index, and 80% of journals in Elsevier are only published in English, right?
Yeah.
So what happens when that is the case?
So I think, there's many different, journal articles that are published in different languages, but they're just not within the scope of what's the most cited. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we have, with COVID research especially, I think this is a great example. And, there's a lot of other political issues that are related to this, but there are, certain articles about at the beginning of COVID where they were characterizing the virus and its effects on the human body. And they weren't cited at all in English language journals, even though, they have this seminal research that was still, found out by American or English speaking scientists like in the States later on. So it kind of just, goes to show that these complex problems like epidemiological problems such as COVID, especially environmental conservation problems, you really need this multilingual, more global solutions in order to be able to move forward. And the fact that these English language journals are more valued in terms of the scientific community, and that if you don't publish in these journals, then your article is much less likely to get cited, is something that we think is a just recurring issue within the STEM Academy.
Yeah, and I think there are these barriers that are in place, right, to doing this, because I imagine that I think scientists want to get their papers to be read widely as possible and to cite it as much as possible. So what are those barriers that are in place that's stopping researchers from getting their word out in multiple languages?
So I think there are some major infrastructural issues within academia and within journals. I think, it's all about your network and who you know. If you do know the editor, then I think your paper is much more likely to get published. If your name is more well known in the English community, you're more likely to get published. But I think another really big barrier that exists is that if you're trying to publish in a non-native language, for an academic paper, the level of English that you would need is so much higher than anything else. So to be able to translate something from your native language to a non-native language, such as English, takes, first of all, a lot of time and effort that could be spent doing your own research. For example, if you're a graduate student or a postdoc or even a faculty member, and it also costs a couple of $1,000s to translate currently with the current infrastructure that we have from non-English languages to English. So it is both kind of a financial barrier as well as a time barrier as well in terms of what people can be focusing on.
Yeah, I think that the financial barrier is huge, right? And I think
yeah.
From English to another language, about 10,000 or more, and there are some services, right? Some companies that do this, and then going the other direction is also some number. Tell us more about the services that are in place right now.
Sure. So I think, right now, and this is why we kind of wanted to have more of a bi-directional communication. So if, we publish something in English, we want other scientists in our field to be able to read this. So translating from English to another language, as you said, for a normal scientific article length would be about $10,000. And I think that there are definitely companies, and even certain research journals have translation companies that they'll suggest. And these were the ones that actually we looked into, and we looked up what the actual prices are, and we're kind of appalled because that, is the cost of like a microscope lens or, some equipment that is very expensive. So if you have to kind of choose between, having the equipment to do your science versus trying to make your science more accessible to the wider community, I think most people know what most faculty members would choose. And it's not necessarily their fault. It's just the way the infrastructure is based.
Yeah, and I think those incentives, right? And I think in your paper, and by the way, if you've not read, you should click on the links below and read this paper. Highly encourage it. The incentives, right, have to be really in place, both on the journal side and also the scientists, right? And thinking through also maybe in the training process, right, where trainees can learn about translating their work from the early stage. So in your paper, you provide some solutions, right? You weren't just highlighting problems, right? You are creating some solutions, and there's quite a few of them. And one of them in particular that I thought that was interesting is, again, for the federal government to provide some funding, right? To allow researchers to allocate some funding towards translation, and also a working group that will be focused on thinking through these issues. Can you tell us more, one on the funding and then the second on the working group?
Sure. So we thought that the government would probably need to step in to be able to kind of standardize the infrastructure for these translation companies. I think, it's all about supply and demand. And we think that if the government, first of all, was able to talk, I think the biggest thing too is that even if you translate your article, you still need to be able to publish it somewhere. And we would first kind of need to figure out the issue of multilingual publications in, these high-profile journals like Nature and Science, which if you, publish the English version within their journal and then try to publish the translated version, maybe there's an issue with copyright or something. So we would, first want to be able to deal with the issue of the journals themselves being able to host a multilingual platform, which we think the government might need to push for, because this isn't something maybe that they're necessarily incentivized to do by themselves. And then if we had that multilingual platform, then we would be able to, increase the number of translations that were done, and that, these high-profile journals would be able to disseminate to many more people in the world, making it, besides, the price of everything, a little bit more accessible to people in other countries. And then I think that we would also really want the scientists to kind of buy into this. And we think that potentially having stipulations for a government-funded grant, that you have to maybe publish your articles that are based on this specific funding in at least maybe one other language, then that would also kind of incentivize both, at different levels. You have like the scientists, the journals, and then standardizing the translation costs. And this would kind of create maybe an overall more optimal workflow for being able to do this. And then on the other end, we also have other non-English language articles that might be very important to scientists within this English language space that we aren't necessarily able to find or translate ourselves. So we thought it would also be very important to kind of go the other way and maybe be able to identify certain seminal important papers in the field that would be potentially translated to English as well.
Yeah, and I think if the journals could translate the paper and host it right there, right, and compile the citation, because let's be honest, these publishers, the authors want the citation to be attributed. That would help things along as well, to streamline, as you said, to streamline and make it lower the barrier so they don't have to go elsewhere outside to address these. And this brings me to the other point that you bring up, that there are these translation services, and what you call for is really to expand these services, first of all, to infuse some competition, some friendly competition, to lower these prices, right? Competition, prices can reduce.
Capitalism.
Yeah, exactly, basic. And so this brings me to thinking about the grassroots. I think your paper looks at it from the top down. You also do think from the bottom up as well, with a working group, thinking about how to involve the community. I'm curious, though, for some of our audience who are founders in this space or are thinking about launching new initiatives, what advice would you give them? Where areas can they look at in this translation landscape? We try to make these papers more accessible. What are some ideas that they can be thinking more about?
Sure. So yeah, I think having conversations with people in academia, and especially people who are involved more in this, multilingual process has been really helpful for me. I actually had, first of all, JSPG was able to not only host our article in English, but also in 5 other languages. I talked really heavily with one of my translators, who's Greek and is a professor in Wellesley, and talked to him pretty deeply about currently existing machine translation tools. Also at the NSPN panel that you were talking about, Rebecca Tarvin also was kind of bringing this up. And I think that one really important initiative is to figure out the most optimal way to do these translations in order to kind of reduce costs and overall time. I think one of the super important things to think about, and maybe to think about ways, like this working group, is having specialists in the community come up with a specific lexicon of terminology that's really well defined, and then potentially having, the translations for this, because I think that one of the huge issues is that you have like a very specialized word in English, and then you're trying to translate it to another language where you don't necessarily have this terminology. Then a lot of the information is going to potentially get lost if they're trying to do a direct translation, rather than have the overall kind of meaning of that word be translated to the text. And machine translations, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, so machine translation? Mm-hmm.
I think, they can do a really good job for kind of a preliminary run, but then you need a specialist in the field to be able to say, okay, no, this word doesn't make sense in this context, or, this is actually the correct terminology for this term that's, very specialized in my field.
Yeah, and I think that this is the point I was going to make, that I think there's so many areas here where if someone was thinking about trying to solve designing a tool or creating a community, right, they can try to tackle different components of this pathway, right? Whether it's making it easier for someone who wants their paper translated to connect with a native speaker who's a scientist in a different country, right? Or these machine learning tools. I think there's so much in here, and I'm really just excited to see where this field goes in the next 10, 20 years as it grows. And we've come to the end of our chat, unfortunately. Goodness, we need to have you back, Ranya. This was just an opening for this discussion. I want to read a sentence from your paper in the conclusion, in the discussion section. So we urge against carrying into the future a colonial mentality that considers English as the only professional language of STEM. As a guide, we should look to the arts and humanities, which have recognized the importance of non-English work. 10, 20 years from now, Ranya, where do you want to see this field?
So yeah, no, I think that ideally it would be very nice for these big databases that everyone is looking through. So as I kind of mentioned in the paper, in the arts and humanities, they do have, just kind of inherent to the discipline, you need texts from different languages. So it's all kind of there in these highly cited databases that would be kind of Elsevier Scopus level for the science community. And I think that it would be very, very nice to for companies, for the journals to be able to host these multilingual publications. And also I think for the scientific community in general to be more aware of these issues. I think that one of the things, I come from a place of privilege, being a native English speaker, and not having to really think about these barriers. And I've seen, a lot of my colleagues, a lot of my family members, I have Greek and Indian heritage, and I think it's very difficult to come to this country and to be able to, do these things at a very high level in a language that you're not super familiar with. And I think not enough people have enough understanding of those barriers. And I think that part of fostering, an inclusive community also comes from understanding the difficult challenges or the different challenges that everyone is facing. So I think that having more maybe like community-based outreach or courses or something that are part of the curricula, or like discussions and seminars within universities to really discuss these issues and kind of delve deeper into them is also very important.
Yeah, that was a treasure trove of ideas there. Yeah, it's been absolutely wonderful to have you with us. We need you to have you back with us. So for everybody tuning in, this was SCI TV.